We have a new Texas A&M specialist with us today. If I can get her full title, it is Assistant Professor in Extension, Tree and Landscape Plant Health Specialist. She's a certified arborist. She can help you understand probably most things you need to know about trees. I don't want to put too much on your plate for you, but this is Stephanie Adams, and we're super glad to have her here with us today. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. All right, I want to make sure. All right, can you hear me? Is this working? Okay. Okay. All right. So thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. So like Robin mentioned, I have a long history with trees. Even growing up, I was the little kid in the backyard making potions in 5-gallon buckets and catching toads. And so this is just the natural fit. But I've been working in the tree care industry for 24 years. I have worked as a tree climber and done a lot of field work and a lot of plant health care. And my career has trajectored me to here to Texas, which has been fantastic. So like Robin mentioned too, I've been a certified arborist since 2007. I've been a board certified master arborist since 2017. So, and I'll talk about this a little, and I'll explain the differences of that in a little bit. George? Our slide advancer isn't working, so. All right, so for this presentation, I was asked to cover these 4 topics, being tree selection, planting, long-term management of trees, and then pruning, which are all in itself pretty big topics. And so what I'm covering in this presentation, because I only have an hour, is to cover kind of the common things you need to look for when you're doing these tasks or when you're hiring somebody to do these tasks. And then I'm going to give you a ton of free resources where you can find more information. You can also contact Robin. You can contact me if you have any questions. So in the landscape, so I have this image here. So I use the Texas Tree Planting Guide a lot in this presentation because it's the best resource we have in Texas, and it's a really valuable resource. Is here in Texas, where it is really hot a lot of the time, we really think about tree planting strategically because we want to lower our utility bills. We want to prevent the heat island effect. Especially being in urban areas, you have that heat island effect. And so when you think of planting your landscape, you can do that very strategically for even your budget. Because if you can lower your cooling costs, you're going to save on electricity. And so, especially in the North America, you want to plant most of your trees on the west and south side of the house because those are going to be the hottest parts of your house. So as the sun sets, and because we're in the northern hemisphere, the sun comes more from the south. So that's why that is. So that's where you want to plant, especially your shade trees. You also want to make sure that if you have utility lines underneath, or if you have utility lines on your property, you want to make sure you use short trees. I don't know if you've seen trees that have been pruned and they're like giant Pac-Mans around utility lines. And sometimes it makes people frustrated, but sometimes you have to remember either they're going to do that or they're going to remove the tree. Would you rather have no tree? And as long as those pruning cuts are being made properly, which I'll explain in a little bit, it's not causing harm to the tree. It's just a little bit of an eyesore. So if you plant trees that aren't going to get more than 20 feet tall, they're not going to have to do that. So you can always kind of plan ahead for what the aesthetics you want in your yard. So starting off with tree selection. You really want to plant trees. One of the easiest ways to decide which trees you want to plant is as you drive around your neighborhood or around the city or even the state that's in a similar environment or ecological zone, is if you see a tree that looks phenomenal and you've seen it at least 5 times looking phenomenal in different locations, then it's a better chance that it's going to perform well. If you always see the same tree and it always looks struggling no matter where it's planted, whether it be a yard, a park, a parkway, a roadside, if it's always looking like it's struggling, it may not perform well in this zone. So one of the easiest ways to kind of narrow that down is see if a tree catches your eye and you're like, I want that in my yard. It's a really good way to figure out what will do well here in Houston or in the surrounding area. But you also have to consider, like if you go to manicured gardens, so public gardens, arboreta, they have a lot of trees that always look phenomenal there, but they also have a full-time staff to maintain them. And so one resource that I really recommend people utilizing is if you go to any botanic gardens or arboreta and you see a tree you really like, you can actually ask the staff there, what kind of maintenance do you do for this tree? And they would be more than happy to explain that to you because they also like talking about plants and trees. But if you learn that it requires several gallons of water a week, and you're like, I don't want to set up an irrigation system or have to use that much water for a tree, you might want to choose a different species. So you always have to think about how much maintenance am I interested and able to provide for this tree. The other thing with tree selection is half of the tree is below ground. And honestly, it's the more important part of the tree is below ground. Because with some species, you can cut them down and they'll sucker and they'll coppice back up and you can still have a tree. But if you don't have a root system, that tree is not going to survive. So in your landscape, I really recommend get familiar with your soils, especially your soils down to about 24 inches. Know what type of soil. Is it more clay than sand? So that helps guide the water holding capacity. Texas A&M has a really great soil testing lab that I recommend you utilizing. If you just do soil samples from a couple locations in your yard every 3 years, that will help you understand what kind of fertilizer you need. Or do you need fertilizer? Is your soil already perfectly fertile and it doesn't need anything else? Or what kind of drainage you have. So also, if water pools after a heavy rain, so if you plant an upland species, so upland species usually like drier soils. So if you plant an upland species where water pools for days after a rain event, that tree's not going to perform very well there because it's going to have too much water. So just watch those patterns in your landscape over time and it'll help you guide for those decisions. You also need to understand how deep your soil is in different locations. So in Texas, we have areas that have abundant deep soils, and then we have some areas that have very shallow soils. So you also have to understand that. And before you dig, you always make sure you have your utilities marked out to make sure you're not going to accidentally hit some utility lines. And the other nice thing about landscaping is not only if you find a tree in landscapes that do really, really well, you can see, oh, these two plants are frequently planted together. So if you want some plants or ornamentals growing underneath the tree, it's really nice that you can kind of go shopping in yards. That's what I did for years. I had dogs for 17 years. And I'm just like, I'm going to take the dogs for a walk, but really I'm going to go shopping for trees. And you just kind of imagine like, oh, this is how I would do this. And I'd plant that. Oh, that does really well there. So it's really helpful with that decision making. So always pay attention, to what your neighbor's landscapes look like. And if you think they look great, then, you could choose some of those similar plants. Right. So if you see a tree that you really like, or even a plant that you really like, but you don't know plant identification, that is not a problem. There are plenty of resources out there that you can utilize. So the Texas Forest Service has two apps, which is the East Texas Wildflowers and West Texas Wildflowers. While it says wildflowers, it does include trees. So don't be turned off by that. It's still a really great resource. And other identification apps that you can download for free are listed here, which is PlantNet, Picture This, My Tree ID, and iNaturalist. They're all really accurate, especially to the genus level, usually to the species level. But what I tend to do is I'll try to identify it with one and identify it with 3 others, and then take consensus. But the website texastreeid.tamu.edu is a really great resource to have. So tree selection, there are some guiding questions you need to ask yourself and make those observations. So I mentioned a lot with soil, so soil type, soil depth, How much precipitation do you get on average a year? And here in Texas, we see extremes. We see abundant rains and almost flooding, and then we get these harsh droughts. But usually the best resource we have is what is the historical average, especially for the last 5 and 10 years. Kind of let that be your guiding light. You also want to know your cold hardiness zone. So the USDA has the cold hardiness zone map. And Texas has many different hardiness zones. And so what you experience down in, say, McAllen is going to be very different from up in the Panhandle. And so you want to make sure you choose, you know your zone. What is in cold hardiness is usually referring to how much, what low temperatures can those trees handle. So you wouldn't necessarily plant citrus up in College Station. They wouldn't do well. And so knowing those even minute differences is really helpful. And you also have to be aware of how much space you have available. Usually if you want to plant a 20 to 40 foot tree or 40 foot and larger, you don't want to plant that 6 feet from your foundation. You know, you want to plant it so it'll shade the house, but you always have to be aware of if you plant it that close to your house, which you can, but you're going to have to prune those branches for a while in order to coach it up and over that house. So you can, but it is going to require a little bit more maintenance as it grows. Once it's over the house, it's probably fine. You just have to maintain it. But you always have to think about, you know, how much space do the roots have to grow, and then how much, you know, in above ground space it has to grow. So always take that in consideration. There's a lot of times people want to make really harsh pruning cuts because they're like, but this tree got too big. And you know, I always think about everything is either regret prevention or disappointment management. And so if you can prevent a lot of maintenance and a tree getting too big for that space, and if you're selecting a tree, you can actually prevent that in the future. So for tree selection, the Texas Forest Service, again, the best resource we have here in Texas. Again, you have botanic gardens and arboreta that you can visit and talk to those horticulturists and collectors because they definitely know their plants. And even the nurseries and the Texas Nursery Landscape Association. There are fantastic resources out there for everyone to, you know, answer some questions. So always keep that in mind. AgriLife Extension, so we have our horticulture department, the Forest Service, but even I included like plant pathology, microbiology, entomology, because those are the people, like a lot of times when I see trees, I see which ones have problems. And so when people ask me for recommendations, I'm just like, okay, if you don't want these disease problems, choose something else. And so sometimes it's not only what's the most beautiful tree, it's what's the one that has the least maintenance but remains beautiful and easy to maintain. And yeah, there are plant people everywhere. I can only imagine this room. Everybody has their story about a tree they planted or they saw perform, or they have, you know, my grandparent planted this. We all have those stories. And I kind of look at it too as like the more you socialize and talk about your plants, which we all want to talk about plants, you're going to learn more just within yourselves too. And then, so the tree selection guide, this is the website for it. And the nice thing is that you can actually choose whether you want native trees or ornamentals, which is a really nice attribute. And so, and it has a couple different types of tree selection. So they have two, so they actually have an express and a custom tree selection guide. The express guide really covers those trees that are hardy everywhere. So if you want something that you don't have to think about as much and it's going to be as hardy, say, in Houston as it is up in the Panhandle, you're going to get more on that, more of those in the express guide. If you want to specialize some of these selections, you do the custom selector, which is what's pictured here on the right. And so you can actually choose your county. And so you can have it at the county level. How much space do you have for your tree? How tall do you want it? And usually small is up to 20 feet, medium is 20 to 40 feet, and large is above 40 feet. And then if you want deciduous or evergreen, and you want a tree that is a Texas native, has reliable fall color, or has showy, fragrant flowers. And then you can also say that where I want to plant my tree is extremely dry, it's drained, or it stays shady. So you get to refine that search a little bit more. So both of these are really great resources. I noodled around with them last night, and they do give you a really nice selection of trees that are available. And then usually the next step would be go to your local nursery, or you can go to a box store, like a hardware store, buy your trees there and see what's available, and you can kind of match them back to this list. So with planting, with the tree planting guide, there is a really nice decision-making tool that they have. So they have like pre-planting advice. So it'll kind of coach you, like, do you have the space for it? What kind of environment or what kind of microclimate do you have in your yard? And it'll help you that. How to avoid common mistakes during planting. Because it's, after working in the field for many years and talking to a lot of homeowners, it's always kind of shocking that you'll have a tree that's 20 years old, and the problem that it has could be a root issue because it wasn't planted correctly, and that could have been prevented at planting. And unfortunately, now that it's 20 years old and that, that small problem is now a bigger problem, it might kill the tree. So you always want to think pro-prevention. And then it also includes tools for how to plant and maintain trees. So when you're looking at a tree, this is, I have diagrams of a deciduous tree and an evergreen. And these all come from the Tree Owner's Manual, which I'll talk about more towards the end. But this is a really nice diagram. When you think about planting a tree, so you just bought a tree, you spent $50, $100, however much, $20 on a tree, you bring it home, what do you do with it? Do you just dig a hole the same size of the container and plop it in? That is certainly a way to do it. Sometimes you have to ask yourself, do I just want this tree to survive for the next 10, 5, 15 years, or are you planting an oak and you want it to live to its genetic capacity and get to 300 years old, right? You have to kind of look at what your goals are, and you can plant a tree accordingly. So when planting a tree and looking at the height of the tree, the crown, which includes the branches and the leaves, that should be usually 60% of the height of the tree. So, and I'll talk about pruning practices in a little bit and explain why that's really necessary. But if you buy a tree and it's already limbed way up and it looks like all the leaves are at the very top, it looks like a lollipop or a lion's tail, that is not a good pruning practice. And I'll explain that why in a little bit. But the really important thing is when you plant, you want to imagine what the root system looks like. And so when you plant, you always want where the root flare is. So this is the graft union. That's where you see that it goes skinny and then it gets really wide. So a lot of trees that you buy in the store aren't grown on their own root system, and that happens for a variety of reasons. But you usually have a root graft, and then you have the root system. So this area where it starts really belling out, that is called the root flare. And you always want to make sure when you plant a tree, the first like half-inch diameter, assuming that it's a smaller tree, like smaller than 2 inches, you always want to make sure that first half-inch woody root is at or slightly above the soil line, right? Research has been done and has shown that if you plant a tree as little as 3 inches too deep, it will not perform as well as if you planted it actually shallower. So always imagine that, and see how the roots are kind of fanned out like spokes on a bicycle. You want to kind of imagine that too. And then with evergreens, it's a very similar system. Fewer evergreens, fewer but not none, have that graft union. But sometimes when you buy especially a containerized tree or a balled and burlap tree, you'll see a swelling. You'll see the swelling and think that's the root flare. And that's why if you buy a containerized plant, you want to make sure you dig until you actually find that half-inch root coming off the stem. And so that is really, really important, but it's a very similar system. And usually the only big difference between the two is that you prune them differently. So with trees and woody plants, they get planted similarly. Yep.
I have a question.
Sure.
If I have planted a tree too deep, can I just dig away the soil?
So yes.
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. So the question was, if I've already planted a tree or I already have a tree that's planted too deep, how do I manage that? Can I just remove that soil and take it away? So the deep planting is an issue for a couple reasons. One is because the stem is not meant to have that wet organic matter up on the stem. So it can actually encourage wood rot, especially wood rot fungi. So getting mulch and soil away from the stem is valuable. But most tree roots are pretty shallow. Very few mature trees have giant tap roots like a carrot, like we thought which was how we thought trees grew for a really long time. Young seedlings will have that until they start producing their lateral roots. And so most tree roots grow fairly shallow. Usually it's in the upper like 20 inches of soil, and depending on the soil depth and those variables. And so even if you just pull it right away from the stem, all those rest of those roots, if they haven't corrected themselves and started coming up to the surface, they're also going to be basically suffocating and being starved for water. So that's why roots grow closer to the surface, is because roots need oxygen and moisture or water. And so you might want to, if it was my tree, what I would do is I would dig, holes in all 4 cardinal directions, usually within 3 feet of the main stem, and see if those roots are coming up. If it's an established tree and the roots are coming up and they're correcting for that planting depth, I would leave it alone. I would take the soil away from the main stem by at least 12 to 18 inches. But if the roots have corrected it, I would not disturb that. That's not worth it. It could actually cause more harm. Yep. When planting trees, you don't plant trees like you plant tomato plants. When you plant a tomato, at least how I was always taught, is that you plant almost most of that plant in the ground, because that stem will produce roots all the way up and it'll actually give you a more robust tomato plant. But with trees, they don't necessarily all do that. Some will, as a stress response from having organic matter and moisture on the stem, will start growing roots, but it's usually not a good situation. That is not what you're going for. So you want to make sure that planting depth is have that root at the soil line, and it'll perform. You're already giving that tree a good start. Roots need to look like a bicycle. And even this is what I do. Every tree I ever plant, even if it's in container and balled and burlap, I bare root that tree. I have a story that I gave a friend magnolia for Mother's Day, and she was really excited about it. I pulled it out of that 15-gallon container, and I just started wailing on it with a shovel. She's like, "Oh my gosh, what are you doing?" I'm like, "I want to see what the root systems look like, because I want this tree to be here for the next 100 years, because I want to give you a good plant." And so I always remove the soil. I want to see what that root looks like, or what those roots look like. And if you have a root that's going around the stem, you have a stem girdling root, you want to cut that off at planting, and that will set you in the right direction. And a lot of containerized plants, they do have circling roots because of the container. And there's not much we can do about that except for correct it. Those trees can still grow and be perfectly fine down the road. You just have to be a little bit more proactive in its health. Okay. So this is also very true. Don't put a $100 tree in a $10 hole. And these are actually ANSI standards. And I'll talk about the standards for arboriculture in a little bit and explain those a little bit more. But it's actually the rule that the hole depth, and this is not true, it's not the height of the root ball, it's the depth of the root system. Because again, you can buy a plant in a container or in balled and burlap, and there could be 6 or 8 inches of soil on top of that root system, right? So the root ball is not reflective to the root system size. So that's why you want to dig down until you actually find that 1/2 inch root, and that's what should be at the soil line. The hole width should be 2 to 3 times the diameter of that root ball. And the reason why that is, especially if you're planting in clay soil, it's hard for that new young tree that's trying to establish to actually grow out and into that clay soil. So the more you kind of rough that up and you stir it up a little bit and you break it up, it's easier for those little roots to be able to make their way out of the root ball, become hardier, and then it can start really going into the surrounding soils. If you use an auger to dig the holes, or whoever you hire to dig holes, and they just auger it out, and the ball is like the perfect size for, or the hole is the perfect size for that root ball, and they just plop it in. And a lot of installers do this because then they don't have to stake the tree necessarily. But what happens, especially if you have clay soils, if that auger spun too long in the soil, it basically sealed off that, it's clay. So you're basically making ceramics. But you just created a soup bowl. So if we do get a good rain, that water may not drain out from that hole and that tree will drown. So that's another reason why the 2 and 3 feet is important, because it also helps for water movement around that tree. So mulching, water conservation in Texas is really important, especially in urban areas. And one of the best things you could ever do for your tree, this is kind of also a long-term management slide, is mulch your trees. And there's multiple reasons why mulch is valuable and helpful to trees. And that's because the mulch ring, the organic matter of the wood chips and the leaves will actually break down over time and continue to build your soil. So if you ever go to like a new house build where they just installed the landscape, you dig in that soil, is that very good soil? No, it's backfill. I've done enough air spading work where sometimes you find siding and shingles. And then you go to older established houses that were built maybe 100 years ago, and what does their soil look like? It's pretty nice, especially if they've been gardening and they have those roots and that organic matter constantly churning in the soil. So mulch also helps with that, soil building. So when you do mulch, you want to make sure there's none of that mulch up on the main stem that you can see here on the left. And you don't want the mulch necessarily to be thicker than 4 inches once it's established. So when you first put down mulch, it's a little fluffy and then it'll settle down a little bit. So I always give it an inch or two to settle. So I would actually put down like 5 or 6 inches and wait for that to settle. As far as how wide the mulch pile needs to be, I will say in a perfect world, which we don't live in a perfect world, that mulch line would go out to the drip line of the canopy. Because there you're protecting the entire root system, or at least the critical root zone of that tree. And if you want to plant plants underneath trees, go for it. Woody plants grow similar to trees, and so they don't compete for the same resources in the same way. If you want herbaceous plants, make sure they're perennials, so you're not digging and disturbing the root system every year. Turf and trees oftentimes don't mix. Most turf roots grow in the upper, either kind of with rhizomes on the surface or down to about 3 inches, and tree roots will always grow below turf roots. And the turf, as it rains, if you do surface fertilization, the grass roots will actually intercept all of those resources before it even gets to the tree. And if anybody has post oaks in their yards and you want to irrigate your yard, that post oak will probably start declining because they are drought tolerant species and they do not want the water. I'll talk about water a little bit more, but you absolutely do not want to do this. This is what's called volcano mulching, or you can call it mulch Everest. And that's a lot, and you see it all the time. People, especially even professionals, or people who work in yards, they'll pile mulch up on the stem, and we don't know why. I've talked to older arborists, and they say, we tried getting people to mulch their tree for 20 years, and then they do this. So what you can do in this situation is you can actually just pull the mulch back. Not a big deal. You don't even need tools. Just use your hands. Yep.
I've worked at landscape companies for years. Part of the reason for the over-mulching like that is that they want to sell the customer a lot of mulch, and so they bid it like kind of high, and then the guys go out there and they feel like they have to put it all out towards the customer.
Okay.
So you get these just all kinds of stuff like that.
Sure. So the comment was by somebody who's worked for a landscape company. I'm repeating this for especially people online. Is because the consultant will go out, sell the job, and sell it kind of high, and then the workers who actually go out and do the work, they want to make sure they give the customer the appropriate amount of mulch for the bid of the job. Which I've never actually had to respond to that. Like, I'm really glad you told me that. It does make sense, but instead of going tall, go wide. I have also been told that homeowners, they want to look out in the yard and they want to see what they paid for, so they do high mulch for that. I don't know the truthiness of it. And so here on the far left, you can see a proper mulch ring, and it looks like a donut. That's usually what's described as. It looks like a donut. Okay. And so the benefits of mulching is with soil moisture is that if you have bare soil, and this research has been done, having bare soil, having mulch versus turf grass underneath trees and which one does best. This has been published. That if you think about it, if you have bare soil and you have the sun pounding down and you have the winds, that soil is going to dry out faster, right? So having that mulch, even intercepting the wind, will help retain moisture. And actually having those 4 inches of mulch, especially once it's established, it creates a nice microenvironment for the microbiome around the soil and the roots. So it encourages beneficial fungi and bacteria and animals and insects that really continue to build that soil and make that nice little ecosystem. It also helps insulate the roots from high and low temperatures. And just imagine walking barefoot on bare soil in the middle of summer. Is that going to be hotter or cooler than if you walked in a mulch bed? It's going to be hotter. And even in the winter, walking on that bare soil, especially if it's clay, versus a mulch pile, it's going to be a little bit warmer. So it actually insulates the roots really well. So if you want to decrease your watering, but still have the soil moisture your plant needs, use mulch. And with the microenvironment, so especially mycorrhizae, yep.
Ground cover. I've seen ground cover right up to trees. Is that the same principle as the grass? Or is ground cover different?
Ground cover is slightly better than grass, mostly because it gets a little woody sometimes. So the roots grow a little bit deeper sometimes than turf grass. It depends on the ground cover too. It's not an ideal situation because you still have that competition. So if you must have ground cover, I would still put mulch underneath the ground cover and kind of shake it in a little bit so you still have that nutrient cycling and that breaking down and building the soil. Okay. So pruning, yep.
Sounds odd, but what are your thoughts on people who build decks around established trees?
So the question is, what are my thoughts on people building decks around mature trees? And
How does it affect their water and everything else? That's what I was trying to figure out.
yeah, so and that it does impact it quite a bit. And there are some so Texas is my 10th state to live in. So I've worked on trees in many different places, and I've learned a lot of stuff. And coming to Texas and learning about live oaks a little bit more, live oaks are so different. They're fascinating. They're really cool trees. And so live oaks can handle construction better than a lot of other tree species. So they are an exception to this rule. Most trees, if you do build a deck around it, assuming that you have like pylons and it's lifted up off the ground, is that that's intercepting water, so the tree's not getting as much moisture as it would normally. It's also not getting leaves piled down, or you're not mulching it necessarily as much, so you don't have the nutrient cycling. So you think about trees in a forest, people don't go out and fertilize forests, right? So how do trees get nutrients, right? Trees recycle 95% of their system. As leaves fall down, as branches fall down, they break down, they continue to build the soil, and they break it down into nutrients that they then reuse. And so if you do a deck over it, you're probably not going to be mulching underneath it, or if anything, you're going to try to blow the leaves out from underneath it because you don't want things, animals inhabiting underneath your deck. So I'm not a huge fan. You have to be really specific with your management. So do extra watering. You might have to do some additive fertilizers to help with that. So that's actually a really interesting case. Like, I would love to do a soil survey and see how the soil changes even 5 years after installing a deck, which I have a hard time that's not out there somewhere. Maybe I'm just not aware of it. Just a second. Yep. Oh, no. The question is there any rule about using leaves as mulch?
I mean, the homeowner association is always after.
Yeah, so and his comment is about how HOAs, they'll remove all the leaves and then to put down mulch, which, like, you just had this for free. And part of that is personal preference. Some people think that leaves look messy, but mulch rings look clean and tidy. You know, there's a lot of personal preferences out there. I personally, in my yard, I leave my leaves and I just mow them and mulch them in. But I also mulch too, so. But no, I would say if it's my preference, leave the leaves. And even if you get branches falling down or twigs falling down, a lot of times I'll just break those up into small pieces and just throw it underneath the tree, because when you buy mulch, that's a lot of what that is. There's another question?
Yeah, question. You've alluded to it already, but you talked about the viability of a tree and how it's affected by the soil compaction. Because we do a lot of mowing, we do a lot of things. I don't think we're aware of how serious that does affect the tree.
Yeah, soil compaction is really a big problem. Excuse me. And so when you compact soil, especially clay soils, sandy soils take a little bit more to compact. So basically what compaction is, you're usually weight loading the soil. So driving trucks underneath it, machinery, anything like that. Even walking on wet soil also compacts it. That's why you don't want to walk in your garden after it rains, because you're going to end up with these bricks in your garden. So compacting the soil affects the trees in a couple ways. It decreases the air pore spaces, which roots need because they need oxygen. It also removes the water pore spaces. And so then the water's not available to the trees. So then it actually thirsts. And the other thing is, if it's too much compaction, if it's something really heavy, it actually causes mechanical injury. It crushes the roots. And so I'm actually getting ready to start an experiment looking at post oaks and seeing what we can do with post oaks, especially that have experienced compaction related to cattle. But yeah, so hopefully next time, in a year, hopefully I'll have some results. Yep.
I've heard plus and minus comments about painting the wound with black paint or some substance. What's your opinion?
So the science behind it, one of the big reasons why historically we painted wounds was the idea that we're keeping decay fungi out. Or even with oak wilt and Dutch elm disease is the idea of keeping those fungi out for a long time. And now we know that the really big problem is if you paint a wound, a lot of times you have a higher chance of actually trapping decay fungi in than keeping it out. So right there, that's already scratched. With oak wilt and Dutch elm disease, you do oftentimes paint or put tar, ideally even latex paint. Usually you carry around a thing of brown spray paint. If I have to prune oaks and elms, when the beetles who move those pathogens around are active. And so here in Texas, even the oak bark beetles that especially spread it to the red oaks, they're usually active from early spring, so April-ish, until about June, when it's actually too hot for them to be out. And so if you have to prune a tree during that period when they're active, I would encourage people to actually paint pruning cuts, especially on the red oak species, because that's how it's spread to the red oaks. And if you have an American elm, and if you know there's Dutch elm disease in that area, you also want to paint it then. And because when you make that pruning cut, do you ever notice that there's a smell, the smell of pruning? And so the trees will actually give off gases, volatile organic compounds, that attract the beetles, especially with Dutch elm disease. And so painting it actually prevents the tree emitting those gases, which basically means that the beetles can't find the wounded tree. Yeah. You had another question in the back?
I was just going to piggyback on her about, you go to tropical places and you see the palm trees painted white. What is the purpose?
I have to admit that I am still new to palm trees, and I cannot answer that right now.
Leave the leaves, does that apply to magnolia leaves also? They seem to get moldy before they disappear.
Yeah, so with magnolia leaves, they tend to get mold. So do they have like a black mold on the surface? Do you have magnolia scale or any insect problems? Like, are they sticky? No? Okay. Okay, so if they're sticky, the stickiness is a lot of times a substance called honeydew, which is a really polite way to say sugary insect poop. And so what happens is the honeydew will land on leaves or even on your driveway, and fungi that are in the environment, the sooty mold fungi, will actually grow on that sugary substance because it's nice, cheap carbohydrates. And they will actually make things all black. But you have to have that stickiness. That's when you know you have honeydew. Most leaves, or actually I think all leaves, have fungal associations with them, even when the tree's alive and they have a mutually beneficial relationship. And then once those leaves die, then those fungi become more active. And fungi are primary decomposers. And so if the tree is otherwise healthy, I would say leave them and just mow them in because they are pretty leathery. Yep. So a lot of times when I have leaves to mow, I'll throw them out in the middle of my yard or rake them out to the middle of my yard and mow them a couple times and then brush that all back with a rake. Yep.
They do sell leaf shredders that you can use, and that helps with an HOA. If you grind it up real fine, they don't recognize it as being leaf matter as much anymore.
That's a good tip. So his tip was they do sell leaf shredders, and I'm sure you can rent them too. And so especially if you work in an or live in an HOA, if you shred the leaves to a really kind of more fine powder, then they don't know they're leaves, and then you can utilize them that way. Yep.
I mow the leaves.
Mm-hmm.
To the basket.
Mm-hmm.
I mow it 2 or 3 times.
Okay, so you collect your leaves and then spread them back out and keep mowing over them.
Yeah, mow it
Yep.
2 or 3 times to the small pieces, and then
Yep, that works too.
get this HOA
Yep.
off my back.
Yep.
$180 off.
Oh. Okay. Okay, so pruning goals. So when you're thinking about pruning, you can always remove dead, diseased, or dying branches. And you can also include they're broken. And so those are always, without a question, go ahead and remove those. Nope, yep. And one of the most important things, especially if you're planting a new tree or if you have a relatively young tree in your yard, if you prune them in the first 15 years of establishment, it will make their maintenance and pruning costs and needs so much lower moving forward. Because if you encourage that tree to develop a good form, you can remove, say, a 1-inch branch that's growing in a goofy direction, which I'll explain that a little bit, versus waiting 20 years and removing a 6-inch branch, right? It's going to take that tree so much more energy to seal over that 6-inch wound than a 1-inch wound. So, and I hear all the time, people are like, well, I just spent, $500 on planting a tree. I don't want to pay somebody to prune it too. And that is a good investment. That will pay off in the long run. You want to prevent large pruning wounds in the future. And then pruning helps develop good branch attachments, which I'll talk about in a minute. So first, if you haven't really studied branch anatomy, people have asked me, they're like, well, how do I know where to prune the tree? My answer is where the tree tells you. Like, it's simple as that. Like, we're not telling the tree how to maintain itself. Trees live without humans. But if you know how to read and understand tree and branch anatomy, you can see exactly where that pruning cut is made. So a proper pruning cut is really important because it will encourage the tree to seal over that wound faster, which means it has less of a chance of having decay fungi and having other types of problems. And that's also because if they're properly pruned, they require less energy in order to seal over them, and decreases the chance for wood rot. So here on this picture on the right, you can see that you have the main stem, which is the larger stem on the right, and you have the branch on the left that's angling off at about 45 degrees. And what you can see in this picture is you have this furrowed area called the branch bark ridge, and that is where a proper branch, its wood is actually intertwined and woven into the stem tissue. And so where that weaving occurs is where the branch collar occurs. And then you have the branch collar, which is this swollen area, which is referring to. So you can see from here to here, it's a little bit bigger than the rest of the branch, right? That's the branch collar. You never want to cut the branch collar or the branch bark ridge. If you need to make a pruning cut, you actually make the cut right here. So you can see where the branch collar tapers a little bit and the branch gets a little bit skinnier. That is where the final pruning cut should be made. And the reason why you want to be very specific with that is because in the branch collar, the trees have specific hormones and chemicals that will encourage sealing. And so even if you see a tree that's been pruned and they cut it in the middle of the branch, usually what happens, a couple things happen. Either it can resprout and you can have a bunch of shoots coming off of it, or that tree has to wait till that branch actually decays and falls off before it can actually seal over that wound. And again, that prolongs that, and then in order for that to decay and fall off, you have to have decay fungi, which is also an issue. So that's why making the pruning cut in the right spot is really necessary. And when you're thinking about tools, if you're using hand pruners, especially with small cuts, that's usually smaller than an inch, you want to use bypass hand pruners. On the market, you can buy the ones that are called anvil, so it's like the two surfaces coming square up with each other. You don't want to use that for making pruning cuts because that cuts through crushing the tissue, because that lower surface is not a cutting tissue or a cutting surface. So the bypass hand pruners actually cut through the surface. They're very sharp, and they don't crush the tissue as you cut it. The anvil type pruners are oftentimes used more in grafting. So they're still necessary and valid. We need them. But when you're making pruning cuts for your tree, you want to use bypass pruners. And that's also true for loppers. And for saws, a lot of people for a long time use bow saws. People still use bow saws quite a bit. It is worth the investment to get a proper arborist handsaw. They are more expensive, but they will stay sharp longer. And even if you have to prune in between two branches, if you have tight branch unions, getting this bow is sometimes tough to get in those spots. And so you can ensure those proper pruning cuts a little bit more by being able to slip a saw blade into there. You can get good saws even at box stores, at hardware stores, so you can look for them there. But they are worth the investment. They're going to be a little bit more expensive than bow saws, but it's going to pay off in the long run. And then pole saws and loppers if you're getting anything too high. So there's always a three-step method when making pruning cuts. So if they're smaller branches, so smaller than an inch, you can use the hand pruner, hold the branch, and make that pruning cut. If there are branches larger than 1 inch, you want to use this 3-cut method. Has anybody ever here ever made that pruning cut and then you didn't have a good hold on it and it just peeled like a banana down the stem? You've seen that? So using the 3-point pruning cut actually prevents that from happening. So the first cut, which you can see in the middle, you actually cut from the bottom up and you cut halfway through that stem. And that cut there prevents that peeling, okay? The second cut, you actually go further out and you take the whole limb off. So that takes the weight off. And then once you have all the weight off, usually you have like a 4-inch stub or so, or maybe 6-inch stub. And then you can hold that and make your final pruning cut beyond the collar, okay? And so using this method, you will not get that peeling ever. It's very successful. It's been studied a lot that trees respond to using this method. They do perform better over time. So with crown height, like I mentioned, so with pruning, one big rule is you never want to remove more than 25% of the canopy in 1 year. And if you prune more than that 25%, that tree will go into a stress response because their food comes from their leaves. And so if they think that they're losing their leaves, they will actually put on bad branches or like epicormic sprouts in order to make up for that. So you put that tree into a stress spiral if you do that. So trees have stored energy just like we do. And when you're in a period of stress, the tree will utilize those stored resources in order to grow and perform and defend itself. But if it has to do that too much, it actually depletes those resources. And so it has to replenish those while still growing. And this kind of becomes a compound problem. And so if you remove more than 25%, it will start utilizing those stored resources. and it's unadvisable. I'm actually more conservative. I usually try not to exceed 15 to 20% because I want to be really sure. And different tree species will respond differently. And then even with the height, so if you see this diagram on E, that is the crown height. That should be 60% of the entire height of the tree. And there's reason for that, and this has been researched too, is that if you have that 60% to 40% of the height is as the tree grows, so this is the graft collar or the graft wound right here, but that having that taper properly allows for that tree to produce nice taper over time. And so even in with the branches, you can see that they get wider as they come down to where their attachment point. And so if you take those trees, and I'll talk about lion tailing, and I have images of that in a minute. If you remove all these inner branches, and so the leaves are just at the tips, that changes that weight dynamic. And trees do produce different types of reaction wood in response to different stimuli. And so if you have all the weight at the top, it actually produces poor taper, doesn't have that reaction wood, and has a higher chance of failing and breaking, especially in winds. Yep.
And yet, that seems to be like the common way of pruning in all of our neighborhoods.
Oh, I know. I know. My mom can point out bad pruning now.
I go around and take pictures, it's horrendous.
Yep. And a lot of times, can we go to the next slide, please? All right, I have a picture of the line tailing in a minute. So when you do prune, this is before pruning, so you can see like this branch here is actually going to start competing with the main leader. So what they do with this is they actually remove it back to a side branch and they subordinate it. You're basically coaching that tree of like, don't put more resources into there. I don't want you to be the main leader, right? You can train a tree. So this is after light pruning. I'm a big fan of the light pruning and seeing how the tree performs. Make those pruning cuts. I always take photos every time I prune it too to see how it performs. This is a little bit much in my mind. I would actually leave those and remove them more gradually over time than do it all in 1 year. But over time, that would be a good goal to have. But you can see as these branches get bigger, they're not going to be growing into each other. So like this branch is even growing straight up through the canopy, which means it's going to be hitting other branches. You want to encourage branches to go out from the stem and not straight up, because then you're going to get rubbing and that kind of damage. So if you can remove that and prevent that, again, in the future, it'll pay off. So if you produce that nice form young, that tree is going to be cheaper and easier to manage down the road. All right, so lion tailing. This is also referred to as lollipopping. And so it happens when people remove all the lower branches and leaves from the lower parts of the stem. And it violates that 60% rule. And why they do it, my best hypothesis is because they have one of those chainsaws and a stick, and that's how high they can reach. That's probably one explanation. There could be others. Two, you always have to keep in mind too, when you have trees along roads, the rule is tree limbs above sidewalks need to be pruned up to 8 feet. And over roads, they need to be pruned up to 22 feet. So those are exceptions, but it should only be on that side too. It shouldn't be the entire tree. I also see this, people are like, people really love their turf grass. And they're like, I want my turf to get more sunlight, and so they'll do this, and so it lets more sunlight through. But again, these branches will not produce the taper and the reaction wood they would if they had those proper ratios. And so you actually have weaker branch attachments at this point, so you have a higher chance of failure. So the other problem is if you have a tree that has had a full canopy its entire life, and just like after the winter, we've been inside a lot of times, right? Because it's cold out. And then, does anybody else get sunburns here? And then you go out that first warm day and you have a higher chance of getting a sunburn because our system's not used to it. Similar things happen with trees, is that suddenly sunlight and those winds are able to contact those inner branches. And so you can get sun scald, so basically a sunburn for the trees, and that can kill the branches too.
Stephanie, we have a question online.
Yep.
Question is, the city trim my magnolia that was too close to the power line. And it was certainly more than 25% of the canopy. Is there anything I can do to help it?
I would recommend hiring an arborist because you can retrain a tree, and they'll be able to look at it and figure out what pruning cuts need to be made in order to encourage good growth down the road. And having trees down around utility lines, that is always a struggle because, you know, those utility companies, there are rules, there are ordinances for how far trees need to be away from that. So they will prune it usually at least 10 feet away. So if your trees or your branches are within 10 feet, they're going to be removed. So you can either remove them or hire somebody to move them, or they're going to do it for you. So you do get sun scalding, you get the sucker growth. So you see all this growth down here? These are called epicormic shoots or suckers. And this is the stress response, where if it thinks it's starving, it's going to put up branches wherever it can to get more food. So if you see that kind of water sprouting, and usually these are not proper branches, they're epicormic shoots, and so they have poor branch attachments too. And you have an increase in insect and disease problems because the trees are stressed. Anytime you have stress, just like humans, when we're tired and worn out, we're not sleeping well, we're not eating very well, we have a higher chance of getting head colds, right? And similar to trees, they also have their own immune systems and they also defend themselves. And so you have an increased chance of those problems. So you never, the thumbs are supposed to appear, but the thing is, never top your trees. So topping is basically when you make a pruning cut and you just cut in the middle of the branch. And what happens is you'll get those epicormic sprouts coming up. And none of those are proper branch attachments. They don't have the branch collar. They're actually attached to the tree right underneath the bark, so they're not really interwoven. So you have a higher chance of failures. It does stress the tree because it starves it from food. It will use stored resources to compensate for the damage, and it will weaken to insect and disease problems. And a lot of times people do it thinking the tree's gotten too big, I want to make it smaller. Or I think the canopy's too dense, and so they make those huge pruning cuts. What usually happens with the stress response is that you actually get 5 times more growth from that. So it actually creates a more expensive problem down the road. And causing the hazards. But if you have had if you own a tree that has been topped in the past, you can actually retrain it and to encourage more proper branch attachments. The big thing is if you're going to do it yourself, you just need to look to see, does that branch have a branch collar? If yes, it's a proper branch, you want to keep that. If it doesn't have that branch collar, then it's a water sprout and you want to remove those. So again, hire an arborist. We're all familiar with these practices. They're very common in the industry, so they'll be able to help you a little bit more. Yep. That is controversial. So the question is there a way to properly reduce the height of a tree? That is a lot of controversy. So one way to do it is, you always want to make a proper branch or a proper pruning cut, so add a branch collar, just so then just ensures the sealing is really efficient. So that's number one. If you can make proper branch or pruning cuts and take off some of the height that way, that would be an acceptable way to do it. Doing the proper pruning cuts is probably the biggest issue with making those kind of pruning cuts. But yeah, it could be accomplished.
Like a fruit tree.
Oh, yep. No, fruit, okay, so I'm glad you brought that up because the way you prune fruit trees, you do not prune ornamentals and shade trees. Those are 2 completely different systems. So what I've been talking about is largely been pruning shade trees and ornamentals. With fruit trees, they do things very differently because a lot of times trees will produce more fruit or bigger fruit on those new sprouts. So they actually want to make those harsh pruning cuts to get those sprouts so they get more fruit or bigger fruit. So that is a completely different system. But yeah, you are right. So long-term care. So you planted a tree, it's 20 years down the road, now what? A lot of it is water management, water and soil management. Remember, half that tree is below ground. That's half of its life is below ground. And so you want to make sure you don't want to blindly water. A lot of times, if you see canopy symptoms, many things can can cause that dieback, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so, too much water and too little water actually look exactly the same above ground. And so, and I'll explain those dynamics in a minute. So you always want to check your soil, or at least start noticing those patterns. If you just moved into the house, check the soil like the day after a rain event and see how saturated it is. And then check it 3 days after the rain event and see how saturated it is. And so you'll learn the drainage patterns and behavior of your soil. But yeah, don't blindly water. Get a soil probe, get a shovel. You only have to dig down about 10 inches, which is where most of the root system is. And that will tell you how moist it is. And if it has a nice amount of moisture, like it's not sopping wet, you can't squeeze water out of it, or it's not powdery and dry, if it has that little bit of moisture, you're good. But trees do need about 1 inch of water a week. And during higher temperature and drier days, especially with winds, they'll probably need a little bit more. You always want to encourage soil health, so you mentioned soil compaction. And you want to know that symptoms of different problems look similar, right? And so drought, too much water, root diseases, a limited root space, soil compaction, all look similar above ground. So this is just one example of, it's also kind of a calibration test. How many different color greens do you see in this? And this is important because we all see color differently, and that's just our biology. And being aware of what colors you can see and not see really helps, especially when I'm trying to identify plant diseases or plant problems. And so there are 3 shrubs in here, and they are slightly different color. So from the side, this is what these trees look like. So you need to learn how to read plant body language in order to be able to understand where you need to look to identify where the problem is. And this is true whether you have orchids or violets or peace lilies or trees. It's so trees can only communicate in nonverbal, non-human language. So think about, does anybody here have a dog or a cat or been around a baby? Do they communicate with you? Yeah. Right. And so part of it is like, I'm confident that everybody in here has seen something that looks like a little symptomatic on a tree. You just couldn't quite put words to it. So all trees have is their color, their form, their branching, where the leaves are being produced, and actually what the different tissues feel and look like. And so if you see plants look like this, you can see this plant, this is a yew, this is Taxus. So this is actually from Illinois. Forgive me, I need to gather more of my Texas photos. So you can see that it's a little bit more yellow, and it's not really putting on a lot of growth. And compare it to this one on the far right, where it's that dark, nice dark green, and you can see it has about 8 inches of new growth coming off of it. So this plant's really vigorous. And these are clonally propagated, so they're the exact same species, they're installed at the same time from the same person. And this plant is somewhere right in the middle, right? It's probably putting on 3 to 4 inches of growth. So with this body language, you can already see by the color, some are not performing as well, but even the growth is different. So as it turns out, this plant, this was a new installation in a garden. And long story short, this area had poor drainage, which we didn't know until after the installation. Sometimes you have to learn by trying. And so when they dug this up, it was a wet, sopping mess. Like, when you get stagnant water, it smells sour? Yeah. That's what this was. So this was an unfortunate accident. It was a good learning experience. But even here, so this is outside of our building in College Station, is you can see live oaks, and you can see that halo of dead branches right around the top. And I just did the color contrast to help see that. What are different reasons you can think of that could cause this? Root problems. What else? Stress, drought. What else? Could be cold damage, right? So you don't know until you start digging around a little bit, literally. George? Oh, sorry. He's taking a bite of soup. All right, so when you read a tree canopy symptoms, and keep in mind with this diagram, I'm a plant pathologist and arborist. I'm not an artist, but it'll get the point across. So you have this happy little tree. George? And if you have a couple branches that start turning color, what we call flagging, you need to identify what's the causal problem. Basically, when it starts doing that, there's a bottleneck of resources for some reason. And so you need to identify what is the bottleneck, why is it occurring, can we resolve it? So in order to find where that problem is, you need to look at where that branch is attached, and that's where the bottleneck is. So could it be a squirrel chewing around it? Could a rope been tied around it? Could be a fungal disease, could be insects boring into it. We don't know until we look a little bit closer. So you want to identify where the dead tissue meets the live tissue, and that's where your answer lies. Okay. But when you have multiple parts of the tree, especially at the outermost portion of the tree, having these symptoms, so if you think about it, the outermost part of the tree, it takes more energy to get water and nutrients to those outer parts, right? And so if there is a problem transporting the water and nutrients up the tree, that could be one problem, but it could also be in the roots, because the roots support the entire tree. I mean, statistically, you could say squirrels chewed on every single one of these branches. Could it happen? Absolutely. It's possible, but probably less probable. So one way to investigate this is you just walk around the tree. Did a car hit the tree? Is there a rope tied around the tree? See if the bottleneck is on the stem. If the tree above bound part looks perfectly fine, the problem's in the roots. Go ahead. And so you want to make sure before you take any action for management, you want to make sure you're treating a diagnosis and not a symptom. Because if you go to the doctor with a cough, is your doctor automatically going to give you the antibiotics for tuberculosis? No, he's going to ask you some questions and probably take some tests. And similar with a plant is that you need to identify what's actually the problem and resolve that. So if you have a root rot, a lot of people are like, oh, water and fertilize it. That could actually be making the problem worse. And so problems that look like feeder root rot, so this is a small root system, and you can see where the roots are normally kind of more that creamy yellow-white, but you have these dead collapsed areas here. This is a root rot. This is a Rhizoctonia root rot. And so this could be, from poor irrigation practices or soil saturation, soil fertility. You could have a high amount of salt, which is an issue sometimes in Texas soils because we have very salty water. And so, but it can also be plant pathogens, and you can also get high soil temperatures. So when you buy containerized plants, keep in mind, especially if they're in black containers, those are going to get really hot. And a lot of times growers will grow them in a block, and so those plants that are along the periphery are going to get more sunlight and that sort. So that's why you really want to investigate the roots when you buy plants, because you want to see what's on the surface may not be reflective of what's happening inside that core of that ball. And also, as you're gardening, keep in mind, pay attention to the roots of plants that you dig around, because elm roots look very similar to, or very different from live oak roots. And so this is a nice diagram where these researchers were looking at bacterial population, different size roots. And so if you see the hickory, the Carya up top, you can see how it has dozens of tiny, tiny, tiny little fine roots. While this is a tulip tree, I should have written the common names, I'm sorry about that. But the tulip tree, their fine roots look huge, right? And so if you dig around a hickory and the root system looks like a tulip tree, is that an underperforming root system? Yeah, because in order for that to look like this, it has to not have so many of those small roots, right? And the smallest roots, those are the roots that are responsible for water and nutrient absorption, and it's also where mycorrhizae make their associations. And so if you don't have those, the mycorrhizae aren't going to establish as well. So you always want to check for soil health. This is another situation where there's water saturation, but if the soil is gray and it smells bad, that means you have saturated soil, which is usually a bacterial soft rot. Healthier soils will be brown, and some of this white in here is actually the hyphae of the fungi growing in the environment. If you see those white threads, those fungi growing in your mulch, that's good. That's a really good sign that your mulch is breaking down properly and doing what it's supposed to do. So we mentioned, I've already talked about water trees and turf grass. You don't water trees like you water turf grass. Again, their roots are a lot deeper than turf grass roots. So a lot of times with irrigation for turf, you do it for 20 minutes, like 3 times a week, something like that. While with trees, they need a long, slow soaking, and they need about 1 inch of water a week. So you can turn on a sprinkler, usually for about an hour, put a rain gauge underneath it, and once that has 1 inch of water in the rain gauge, you know you can stop. But the reason is because the water needs to percolate down into the soil in order to actually get to the tree roots. And actually, watering trees like turf encourages those roots to come up to the surface because they're looking for water. So if you get really tired of hitting roots in your yard, you can actually water them deeper and encourage those roots to go down a little bit. Resources, and I'm looking at the time, I'm sorry. So there's a lot of resources out there. The next portion of this talk is just going to be resources that you can all find online, so I'm going to go over them a little bit quick. Yep.
I was going to say about the turf grass, don't use weed and feed. I see that a lot.
Yes.
When people, they have mystery tree problems, trees sick.
Yep.
What kind of fertilizer are you using? 9
Yep.
times out of 10, it's weed and feed.
Yes, that is, you mentioned that don't use weed and feed around your trees because a lot of times that will affect your trees too. Because most weed and feeds, those will select for monocots or grasses, and they will affect all broadleaf trees or dicots. And so, yeah, that is a very good point. So when people always ask for resources, so I'm mentioning the ISA first. So the International Society of Arboriculture is not only the overseeing organization that does education, training, and especially the credentialing. So if you've hired a certified arborist, they got this credential from the ISA. They have a lot of really good resources online, and there's many, this is just a small selection of the different types of credentials that they offer. There's many more. And so their resource, the ISA's resource for more of the homeowners is actually the treesaregood.org website, which this is really phenomenal. It has tree owner information. If you want to hire an arborist, you can actually use this to find an arborist. So you can either do it by your zip code or you can do it by your city and state. You can search for them that way. And then the other organization that does a lot of training is the TCIA, so the Tree Care Industry Association, and that focuses more on business, on the business owners, building businesses, getting businesses the resources they need to continue to grow. But they still do a lot of education and training for tree workers. They also have a lot of resources, especially the ANSI standards. So is anybody familiar with ANSI here? So has anybody ever heard of like an OSHA investigation? Okay, so OSHA is the investigative organization that does regulation. But OSHA employees don't know every single industry out there. So what happens is specialized industries will create their own standards that the OSHA investigators will actually use during an investigation. And so in tree care, ANSI A300, those are the tree care standards. So as a homeowner, if you're like, I want to know, what do I need to look at to see if my arborist is doing a good job, you would actually look up A300 because that tells you exactly how those pruning cuts should be made. That tells you exactly how those trees need to be planted. And those are the industry standards. Z133, those are actually just the safety standards. And so if you're seeing an operation and you're like, do they have the right PPE on? Are they being safe? You can actually look up Z133 and it'll tell you they should have hard hats, they should need hearing protection, glasses, and the different PPE. And so I'm going to make this presentation available to you, so don't worry about that. So the ANSI 300, just to give you an idea of what topics they cover, so root management, integrated pest management, planting, soil management, pruning, anything that you can imagine, this is where that goes to. And a lot of the resources that I showed you today do utilize and use the same resources. So there's kind of one voice. One thing to keep in mind, if you buy the ANSI standards, they are written as legal documents because they go to OSHA. So they can be a little tough to read sometimes unless you like reading legalese. But so what happens is then they're basically translated into the best management practices. So this is what usually people will buy if you want the ANSI standards. They're written in a non-legal format. They are easier to read. They're about the same price. And so if you're like, I want to plant a tree and make sure I'm doing it correctly, you can spend $20 and get actually the standard yourself. So Ed Gilman I'm mentioning because he literally wrote the book and did the research on how to prune a tree. And he also did the research on understanding if you buy a containerized plant that has circling roots, how to manage that. He's the one that did that. So he retired from the University of Florida, but their environmental horticulture department has a phenomenal online resource. And while Florida is a little bit different than Texas, those practices are the same. And it's really nice because he actually has 51 videos for free that you can watch yourself. And he's a very good teacher. The other resource I recommend, and you can get this off of the Trees Are Good website, is the U.S. Forest Service has the Tree Owner's Manual. And if you don't want to buy anything else or look at anything else, I would get this. It's free. There are two versions. There's 2008 and 2021, so get the 2021 version. But it covers everything that I talked about today, and even all the ANSI standards. Get the Tree Owner's Manual. And if you're like, I just bought a house, what's the timetable of when I need to do different types of maintenance? This is a neat table for maintenance schedules that's actually in the Tree Owner's Manual. So it kind of gives you a better idea of when things need to be done. I do encourage people to make sure you treat a diagnosis and not a symptom, which I talked about a little bit earlier. That is going to get you a better return on your investment. So if you're going to apply a pesticide, you want to make sure it's the correct pesticide instead of just, rolling dice. And one way you can do that is having your plants properly diagnosed using diagnostic labs. So each land-grant university and U.S. territory has a plant disease diagnostic lab. And you can send samples in, they will diagnose them, tell you what it is, and then also give you recommendations for treatments. So even if you're not going to do the treatments or do the applications, you can hand that report over to whoever you hired to do the work and say, this is what it was diagnosed with. Please treat for that. But they also a really great resource. Here's their information if you need it. Their website includes a lot of different fact sheets from AgriLife Extension, which is a really great resource. But you can also, if you have a question, if you don't know if it's a problem, you can email photos, and that's free. And they'll tell you, okay, yes, this needs to be, you need to send this in, or, oh, though, this is really common, I can just answer that now. So just communicate with them and create that relationship. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. And thank you for inviting me. This is an honor to come and talk to people about trees and tree problems. But if any of you have any questions, I can stick around for a little bit. I can't. I can make house calls. If I do that, I would rather, get in contact with your county agent first, because we support each other too, and they're more local. But yes, that is a possibility. Yep.
You did say you got your presentation online, right?
I will, yes. I will give it to Robin, and she'll make it available. Yep. There's another question?